That day, Clara was fired from her job. As she walked, unsure of what to do with her injured arm, she heard a scream. A small child was about to fall. Without hesitation, she moved into action, and at that moment, she had no idea that she wasn't just saving a life, but also changing her own destiny. Because this brave decision would lead her to a man she never expected and a whole new future. Clara was getting ready to leave the bakery after a long, exhausting day. She ran her hands along the edge of her flour-dusted apron, letting out a slow breath as she took one last look around the small shop. The scent of freshly baked bread still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of pastries that had long been sold. Normally, she found comfort in these familiar smells, but tonight, they did nothing to ease the tight knot forming in her chest. She had spent the entire day on her feet, forcing a smile at every customer, even as exhaustion threatened to drag her down. Lately, business had slowed, fewer customers, less income, and an ever-growing weight of worry pressing down on her shoulders. But worse than that was the accident she had a few days ago. In a single moment of carelessness, the heavy tray she had been carrying slipped from her grasp. She had tried to catch it, but the sudden movement had thrown her off balance, and she had fallen hard. Even now, she could still feel the sharp ache pulsing in her arm, a painful reminder of the doctor's words. "You need rest if you want the bone to heal properly," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. Rest, as if that were an option. Bills didn't wait, rent didn't pause, and she had no safety net to fall back on. Sighing, she reached for her coat, ready to head out into the freezing night. But just as she was about to slip it on, a voice from behind made her stiffen. "Clara," the bakery owner called, his tone hesitant. She turned slowly, her heart already pounding. He was walking toward her, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. But as soon as she met his gaze, a sense of dread settled deep in her stomach. "I'm sorry, but we're going to hire someone new," he said, his voice unsure yet unwavering. "Your arm is slowing things down, and the bakery is struggling right now." Clara's breath hitched. For a moment, the words didn't quite register, as if they had been spoken in a foreign language. She stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. But there was nothing, just the quiet certainty in his eyes. Her throat tightened. "What if I take some time off and you hire someone temporarily?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. She hated the way it wavered, how it made her sound so fragile. But she wasn't ready to give up. She had given years of her life to this place, pushed through every hardship, never once complaining. The bakery owner shook his head, his expression turning colder. "You're too clumsy for this job, Clara. I'm sorry." And just like that, it was over. The lump in her throat grew unbearable, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to keep standing. He didn't even give her a chance. After everything, after all her effort, she was being cast aside like she was nothing. Slowly, she turned away, wrapping her thick scarf tighter around her shoulders as if it could shield her from the bitter sting of betrayal. She stepped outside, the icy wind slicing through her like a blade. The snow beneath her shoes crunched with every step, a lonely, hollow sound in the quiet night. Her hands curled into fists inside her pockets, but she had no idea what to do next. The cold seeped into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness spreading in her chest. Clara tried to process what she had just heard as she quickened her pace. While walking on the snowy sidewalk, a high-pitched scream echoed through the cold air, making Clara's heart race. She paused for a moment, straining to listen. The scream came again. It belonged to a child. A sudden wave of fear rose inside her, and she quickly scanned the area. Between the darkness and the gently falling snow, she spotted a small silhouette swinging from the branches of a large tree not far ahead. The child was trying to hold on to the bare, slippery branches, but their thin arms were trembling, about to give out. Their feet were flailing helplessly in the air. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and her eyes widened. The child could fall at any moment. "Don't let go," she shouted, her voice rising in panic. But the child, hearing her, looked at her for a brief moment with fear in their eyes before losing their balance completely. Clara's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, she lunged forward. There was no time to hesitate. The pain in her arm was forgotten for a second. The ache became irrelevant. All she could think about was catching the child. A second later, the child began to fall. Clara held her breath, stretched her arms wide, and with all her strength, she caught them. The impact sent her falling onto her back into the snow. As the cold of the snow penetrated her body, she wrapped her arms tightly around the child, using her body as a shield to soften the blow. The moment they hit the ground, the pain in her arm became sharp and intense, radiating from her shoulder down to her fingertips. She clenched her teeth and squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the pain aside. The only thing that mattered was that the child was safe. For a few seconds, the only sound she could hear was her own quickened breathing. The child lay silently in her arms. Finally, they slowly lifted their head, locking eyes with Clara, filled with fear. "You caught me," the child whispered, their voice trembling. Clara struggled to catch her breath, feeling the trembling body in her arms. The child was small and delicate, frozen stiff with fear. Their tiny hands were gripping Clara's coat tightly, as if afraid that if they let go, they would fall again. "You're okay, right?" Clara asked gently, though her voice was filled with concern. The child slowly shook their head, but the fear in their eyes hadn't disappeared. Clara took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and tried to calm herself. The pain in her arm throbbed unbearably, but that didn't matter now. Clara noticed the strange widening in the child's eyes. His small body was still trembling, and his breathing was irregular. Maybe it was just fear, but what if he had had a seizure? What if there was internal bleeding or something else? Her worry grew inside her, and she held her breath, ignoring the pain in her arm as she quickly pulled out her phone. With trembling hands, she swiped the screen and called for an ambulance. With her other hand, she gently touched Felix's shoulder and locked her eyes on his face. "Don't worry, help is coming," she said in a soft voice. The little boy slightly shook his head, but still clung tightly to the edge of Clara's coat. At that moment, footsteps could be heard from a distance. Clara lifted her head and noticed a tall silhouette approaching in the dark street. The footsteps quickened, leaving clear marks in the snow as they came toward them. Within seconds, a tall, charismatic man in an expensive suit appeared in front of them. His face was tense, his eyes filled with worry. "Felix," he called out, rushing toward the child. "Did this story pull you in? What do you think will happen next?" If you don't want to miss more impactful stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Felix slipped from Clara's arms and ran toward his father in small steps. The man bent down and tightly embraced his son, his fingers running over the boy's back as a slight sign of relief appeared on his face. But he was still worried. As he checked the child over, his expression hardened, and he lifted his head to face Clara. His gaze was sharp and full of meaning. "Did you save my son?" he asked, his voice filled with determination but also gratitude. Clara took a tired breath, adjusting her shoulders slightly, and nodded. "Yes, I saw him at the top of the tree, and I caught him just as he was about to fall. Luckily, it wasn't serious." The man took a deep breath, briefly glancing from Felix to Clara. For a moment, an unreadable expression appeared on his face, a mix of gratitude and astonishment. Finally, keeping his seriousness, he extended his hand to Clara. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I'm Alexander Falcon, Felix's father. I'm grateful to you." Clara hesitated but reached out her hand. The man's firm and determined handshake conveyed his sincerity. She smiled faintly, though the confusion inside her had not yet settled. She was still coming to terms with the shock of the event, and she thought Felix still needed to go to the hospital. Meanwhile, the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. The ambulance was arriving. The sound of footsteps echoing through the hospital corridors and the low murmurs of conversation filled the air as Clara sat in the waiting room, taking a deep breath. The fatigue and pain inside her were more pronounced now, amplified by the effect of the incident. While Felix was being examined by the doctors, one of the nurses came over and told Clara that she needed an X-ray. She could already feel the ache in her arm, but with a bad feeling growing inside her, she took another deep breath and stood up. The minutes in the X-ray room felt like hours. After the films were taken, the doctor furrowed his brow slightly as he looked at the screen. "You've broken your arm before, haven't you?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Yes, a few days ago, but it was starting to heal, I think." The doctor took a deep breath and shook his head. "Unfortunately, that's not the case. The fracture worsened during the fall. You should have been more careful, Clara." Clara's heart sank. She had lost her job, and now her arm wouldn't heal for a longer period of time. She lowered her gaze, avoiding eye contact, unsure of what to say. Just then, Alexander stepped into the room, leaning against the doorframe. He must have heard the entire conversation. "Is it serious?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. The doctor turned to him and gave a brief explanation. "The bone healing will take longer than expected. She needs to avoid working for at least a few weeks. Otherwise, there could be permanent damage." Clara sighed deeply. The thought of not being able to work for weeks, it tightened her stomach. How would she pay the rent? Food? The electricity bill? The overwhelming thoughts echoed in her mind, suffocating her. Alexander remained silent, watching her. The expression on his face showed that, despite Clara's attempts to say everything would be fine, he could see the storm raging inside her. "Not being able to work for a few weeks seems like it will be a big problem," Alexander said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. Clara nodded but kept her gaze lowered. I'll manage," she said with a weak smile. But neither Alexander nor the doctor found this response convincing. Alexander crossed his arms over his chest and tilted his head slightly. "You seem hesitant to ask for help," he said in a low voice. Clara looked at him in surprise. There was a strange understanding in his eyes, as if he could see the battle within her, the financial struggles, the fight she was giving alone, carrying all the weight on her shoulders. Clara felt the weight inside her grow heavier, but she couldn't escape the gaze of Alexander. The next evening, as Clara stirred her tea tiredly in the kitchen, there was a knock at her door. She furrowed her brow slightly. Who could it be at this hour? She walked slowly toward the door, and when she opened it, she found Alexander standing there. He was dressed impeccably as always. With his dark coat and serious expression, he looked quite impressive. But this time, he was holding something in his hands, a check. Clara blinked in surprise, and Alexander extended the check to her. "This is to show my gratitude," he said, his voice calm but firm. Clara's eyes quickly moved to the amount on the check, and she frowned, stepping back. The sum was much higher than she had expected. A wave of unease rose within her. She raised her hand slightly and pushed the check back toward him. "I can't accept this," she said firmly. "I did what I had to do." Alexander tilted his head slightly, looking at her. There was an unreadable expression on his face, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "I know," he said quietly, "but this was a big sacrifice on your part. Your arm got worse, you lost your job. My son is safe because you acted without hesitation." Clara took a deep breath, avoiding his gaze. The idea of being rewarded for what she had done felt uncomfortable. She knew the money could offer her some relief right now, but she didn't want to accept it this way. "I really didn't do it for the money," she said, her voice softer now. Alexander paused for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "I know," he said, "and that's exactly why you should accept this." Clara's chest tightened. Yes, she needed the money, but her pride was standing in the way. There was no pressure in the man's eyes, only sincere gratitude. "Please," Alexander added, his voice gentler this time. "Don't think of it as charity. Accept it as a thank you." Clara took a deep breath and again shifted her gaze to the check. In the midst of her indecision, her hands clenched into fists. "I can't accept it, but thank you for thinking of me," she thought. Alexander didn't insist. "All right," he said, giving in. Alexander had been deeply impressed by Clara's honesty. There was something rare about her, a quiet strength, an unwavering resilience that set her apart from anyone he had ever met. She wasn't driven by money or status, nor did she seek admiration or recognition. Instead, she lived with an unshakable determination, sacrificing her own comfort without hesitation for the sake of simply surviving. Even as the days passed, he couldn't shake the memory of her. Her face, her voice, the quiet but undeniable presence she carried all lingered in his thoughts, refusing to fade. He had encountered many people in his life, but none quite like her. Clara wasn't just enduring life's hardships. She was fighting against them with everything she had, alone. The realization both surprised and moved him. After much contemplation, he finally made a decision. A few days later, he reached out to Clara with an invitation to dinner. It was a simple gesture, nothing elaborate or overwhelming. But when she received the offer, Clara found herself hesitating. Going out with someone like Alexander, a man of wealth and influence, felt entirely foreign to her. Their worlds were nothing alike. She didn't understand why someone in his position would want to spend time with someone like her. There was nothing she could offer him, no reason for him to take an interest in her life. Yet, despite her doubts, she couldn't find any trace of dishonesty or ulterior motives in his words. He hadn't pressured her, hadn't tried to impress her with grand gestures or meaningless flattery. His invitation had been genuine, straightforward, a simple, kind offer. And that, more than anything, was what made her consider saying yes. On the evening they met for dinner, Clara felt a little uneasy, but Alexander, as always, spoke with his warm and sincere tone to put her at ease. During the meal, they talked about life's struggles, Felix, and Clara's past. Alexander listened with admiration to how Clara had managed to stay strong despite everything. Her life was completely different from his, full of struggle and sacrifice. And with each passing minute, Alexander understood more clearly how strong a woman she truly was. When the meal was over, Alexander turned to her with a slight smile. "There's something I want to show you," he said with a mysterious expression. Clara, a little surprised, couldn't resist her curiosity. "Where are we going?" she asked, her brows slightly furrowed. Alexander simply smiled. "You'll understand when you see it," he said, opening the door to his car and waiting for her to get in. Though Clara didn't fully know what part of the night she was a part of, she felt a strange sense of trust in Alexander's genuine demeanor. Unable to suppress her curiosity, she decided to accompany him. What she didn't know yet was that this night would open a new door in her life. Clara fixed her gaze on the shop in front of her. The warm light pouring through its large windows momentarily warmed her. Inside, there were bakery counters lined with shelves displaying freshly baked bread and sweets. The place had both an elegant and cozy atmosphere. As she imagined the delightful scent of vanilla and cinnamon, there was only one question on her mind. Why were they here? She turned to Alexander, astonished. This is a bakery," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander smiled slightly, his eyes warm with reassurance. "Yes," he said, taking the keys to the shop from his pocket and offering them to her. "And it's yours." Clara's eyes widened. She took a deep breath but struggled to find the words. "What does this mean?" she asked, wavering between shock and disbelief. Alexander tilted his head slightly. "You're the owner of your own business now," he said calmly. "And I'm not doing this out of pity, Clara. I'm doing this because you deserve it." Clara's breath became erratic. She clasped her hands in front of her chest, as if trying to calm herself. "But I can't accept this. Her voice trembled, and she looked away. "I'm not used to things like this." Alexander's expression became serious. "I know, but you fought on your own for years. You've struggled to make ends meet, and because of an accident, you couldn't work when you needed to the most. And despite all that, without expecting anything in return, you saved Felix." He took a deep breath, then added in a gentle but firm tone, "Someone like you deserves a chance to stand on their own 2 feet." Clara felt the words catch in her throat. Outside, the snow continued to fall slowly, but she was lost in the storm of emotions inside her. She looked at the shop again, thinking about the hardships of the years she had worked. She had always worked for others, always kept other people's businesses going. But this place, could it really be hers? When her eyes met Alexander's again, she saw a patient yet determined expression on his face. He wasn't just trying to help her, he truly cared about her. Clara reached out with trembling hands and took the keys. When her fingers touched the cold metal, her eyes welled up. This wasn't just a job, it was a new beginning. And this time, it would be entirely for her. Clara's fingers trembled around the cool metal of the keys, her grip tightening as if grounding herself in the reality of the moment. Her vision blurred with the weight of emotions crashing over her like a tidal wave: shock, disbelief, and something far deeper, something she had never dared to hope for. Her voice wavered, barely more than a whisper. "Did you really do this for me?" Alexander hesitated for only a moment, but in that brief pause, something unspoken passed between them. A warmth flickered in his deep-set eyes, a tenderness that had long been hidden beneath layers of composure. His breath came slow and measured as he allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "I've never met anyone like you," he admitted, his voice quiet yet unwavering. "But I've always imagined." Clara felt her breath hitch, her pulse quickening as if time itself had slowed. The night air hung thick between them, but when Alexander took a step closer, it felt as though the entire world had faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in the soft glow of the streetlights. His gaze locked onto hers, intense yet full of something she couldn't quite name, something that made her heart ache in the most unfamiliar way. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper, yet every word carried an undeniable weight. "Yes, Clara, because I'm in love with you," he said simply, as if it had always been the truth waiting to be spoken. "And you deserve the very best." The world around her disappeared. The city, the cold night air, even the keys she held so tightly, they all became background noise to the rapid beating of her heart. No one had ever said those words to her before. Not like this. Not with such sincerity, such certainty. Every kindness she had ever known had come from a place of obligation, of pity. But Alexander, he had seen her struggle, her resilience, the way she had fought for everything in her life. And still he loved her, not despite her battle-worn heart, but because of it. A sob broke free from her lips as tears spilled down her cheeks, unstoppable, overwhelming. For the first time, someone wasn't just offering her help, they were offering her a place where she belonged. Clara clutched the keys to her chest, as if holding onto the promise they represented. A new beginning, a life where she didn't have to keep fighting alone. She swiped at her tears with a laugh that was half joy, half disbelief, then lifted her gaze to Alexander. Her smile was soft but real. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Alexander's expression didn't waver. He simply reached out, tucking a loose strand of her hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "You already have," he murmured. "Thank you," she said, her voice both grateful and happy, the warmth of the moment wrapping around her like a quiet embrace. Alexander smiled, his eyes never leaving hers as he gently took her hand in his. His touch was steady, reassuring, and filled with something deeper than words could express. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, his voice carrying a promise that sent a soft shiver down her spine. Clara barely had a moment to catch her breath before Alexander closed the last bit of distance between them. With a tenderness she had never known, he cupped her face in his hands, his touch careful, as if she were something precious. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both gentle and full of meaning. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. Her world, once filled with struggle and loneliness, now anchored in the warmth of his presence. For the first time, Clara realized she wasn't alone. And this time, life was truly offering her a new beginning. After Clara's arm fully healed, she finally opened her bakery with Alexander's support. What started as a small shop soon became a local sensation, thanks to her passion and hard work. The aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the streets from early morning, drawing in customers eager to taste her creations. Word spread quickly, people raved about her pastries, social media buzzed with glowing reviews, and even local newspapers and food magazines featured her story. Within a year, Clara's bakery had become the most well-known in the city. But more than its success, what truly mattered to her was the journey. She had built something of her own, standing on her own 2 feet. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. She had someone who had believed in her from the very start. One morning, as Alexander sipped his coffee, he looked at her with a proud smile. "I told you, this was just the beginning," he said. Clara met his gaze, warmth filling her heart. This wasn't just a business success, it was a new chapter in her life. And this time, she wasn't walking it alone. If this story touched you and you'd like to see more emotional, inspiring stories, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories and join us. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your ideas.